Good evening. It's my pleasant job to introduce Professor M.S. Ananth, who is the director of IIT Madras. I intended to be a bit careful before I came here because I heard he was on a fundraising drive to Hyderabad, but he told me that he's no longer, so I feel a bit more comfortable introducing him. Professor Ananth is a gold medalist from AC College of Technology. He has a PhD from the University of Florida. And just immediately after his PhD, unlike many of us who stayed back, he came and joined the faculty at IIT Madras in the Department of Chemical Engineering. He held many important positions there. And until in 2001, he was appointed director of IIT Madras. And he was associated with the preparation of the strategic plan for IIT Madras, which is called Vision 2010. He has been a visiting professor at various places, Princeton, University of Colorado, and other places. It's very rare for a good researcher to also be a good teacher, but he is known to be a very good teacher with very deep concern for students, especially engineering professors are known to be very tough, you know that. But he has the reputation of being very nice to his students and deeply concerned about them. He's considered one of the leading educationalists in the country. His research is in molecular thermodynamics and mathematical modeling. He has published widely. He has won many awards. He's a fellow of the Indian Institution of Chemical Engineers and also of the Indian National Academy of Engineering. He's a consultant for many chemical industries in South India. More important, he is a member of the National Manufacturing Competitiveness Council, which is set up by the government to understand or to give suggestions how to energize and sustain the growth of the manufacturing sector in India. I hope we hear more about him. So, Professor Ananth, glad to have you today.
Good evening to all of you. I want to thank Professor Ram Mohan Rao for inviting me to this beautiful campus. But I must also warn you that he is solely responsible for inviting me here. And if I told him that I wasn't an expert in the area, but he insisted that I come and share my thoughts with you. I must tell you that when the introduction was read, they told you I was an expert in molecular thermodynamics and mathematical modeling. I was just telling Mr. Sen that I used to be an expert. The last 3 years, I have not been invited to any thermodynamics conference. I find I get invited on all topics on which I am not an expert. So with those words of warning, let me share some thoughts with you. I am on this council, Manufacturing Competitiveness Council, and we've had a large number of discussions. We've had actually 3 meetings and quite a bit of discussion. I share some thoughts with you on this topic. I must say that as a faculty member in the Indian Institute of Technology, we have had a large amount of interaction with the industry. And at the risk of displeasing some industrialists here, till 10 years ago, the industry wasn't worth interacting with in a serious sense. But in the last 10 years, the industry has changed dramatically. We are in fact going out to meet them. We are requesting that they come and enlighten us on many aspects, especially the manufacturing industry. The software industry, of course, has grown tremendously, but the manufacturing industry, I think, has changed dramatically in the last 10 years. Like I've seen no other industry change in India. We have, of course, a long way to go. I can't resist telling you a sort of a joke that a journalist presented to our students in an extramural talk. This lady said in the 60s, the journalist spoke about India taking off. They said that again in the 70s, they said that again in the 80s. Finally, in the 90s, they said, India must have a long runway. We are hoping now that the runway, we're coming to the end of the runway, we're going to actually take off. I mean, the atmosphere in the country does seem to have changed in the last decade or I suppose since liberalization came in, the thinking at least has changed. And I think, I hope we're really ready to take off now. Let me go on to the next. Yeah, this is to give you some general statistics. The target for the 10th plan, target for 10th plan's growth is 9%, which is extraordinarily ambitious target. But I suppose you have to set ambitious targets to get anywhere near reasonable growth. The agricultural sector has a GDP share of 22%, and the maximum growth you can expect is 4%. In fact, in the recent years, it's been less than that. It's been 2.5. It reached almost 4 some 10 years ago, or even earlier, the Green Revolution in time. And then it came down again. But they are hoping that the agricultural sector will show a 4% growth. So the services sector, which has a 51% GDP share, has not grown at 10%. It has grown, I believe, at 8% maximum, but they are expecting a 10% growth. The secondary sector, which has 26.9%, which includes manufacturing, therefore has to grow at about 11.2%. This breaks up, the secondary sector has, if you take the secondary sector as 100%, you're expecting 11% growth. The others, other than manufacturing, you can expect a maximum growth of 6%. So essentially, we should have a 12% growth in manufacturing to achieve the 9% growth overall. So you're looking at 12% that is unprecedented. The last 10 years, the growth in the manufacturing sector has been 7%. Mr. Sen gave you some encouraging news about the last quarter. But the other recognition is that the workforce in the organized sector is only 8%, and eventually manufacturing, competitiveness or otherwise, you still have to provide employment. I think that's an important aspect of growth in India. Right now, about 11 sectors, there may be additions to this, but in order to produce any growth, you have to choose sectors where there is already some competitiveness, where we hope our competitiveness will improve considerably, and at the same time generate employment, if not directly in the industry, behind the scenes, in the industries that feed into the manufacturing industry. So these are the sectors that have been identified as of now. There may be additions, but even if we achieve a good growth in these 11 sectors, I think we are on our way. There's some pros and cons: natural resources, low wages, highly skilled manpower. At the same time, inefficient regulatory mechanisms, we suffer from that, definitely. The lack of faculty in technological institutions of higher learning. This is a very severe shortage. In fact, the data can be very depressing. I don't know the data in management, but in engineering, we have 400,000 students joining undergraduate engineering education in this country. And we have 20,000 postgraduate seats, of which only 10,000 are filled. If you assume that 1 in 5 will come back to teaching, despite the poor salaries, you are then talking of 2,000 teachers for 400,000 undergraduates, 1:200. And the All India Council of Technical Education prescribes a student-teacher ratio of 15:1. There's no way any college can meet this, which is why if you have ever been as a part of a team of AICTE visiting these institutions, you see the same faces in many colleges. I mean, there's no other way this ritual of satisfying 15:1 can be done. But I think this is a very serious problem. In fact, one solution may be distance education, but it's still not, it's coming up, it will come up within a few years, but it's still not going to meet the complete demand. The thirst for knowledge is there, but the number of teachers is really small. To give you a comparison, the US produces 60,000 undergraduates and 60,000 postgraduates in engineering. So you have an equal number, so you have a much more favorable ratio. High interest and taxation rates is another problem that we have. The globalized economy right now, due to demands of global capital, medium-sized economies can't go it alone. By medium-sized economies, I include India in this, because in terms of overall GDP, we're still not in the large size. There is risk of losing investment and employment through flight of capital. We need low taxes, we need a tight fiscal policy, and we need monetary stability. The government should borrow only to finance investment, not consumption. These statements have been made repeatedly, have been made by the Planning Commission as well. Eventually in India, it has to do with how well it's implemented. The characteristics of economic change, it's extremely rapid, instantaneous mobility of capital across national frontiers, emergence of global networks of production and competition, design, manufacture, consumption of goods and services not constrained by national boundaries. In fact, we have examples where the raw materials goes from India and the finished product comes back cheaper than what we produce ourselves. This is because of various regulatory inefficiencies, partly because of inefficiencies in manufacturing itself. But given this background, the factors that have been arrived at in broad discussions about improving competitiveness are the following. One is infrastructure development. I mean, no amount of words will do. We need very rapid development of infrastructure in many sectors. The second is market framework, regulatory environment. One of the problems with India is that we seem to know the theory very well. In fact, we had a professor of chemical engineering, a friend of mine from Imperial College. He came here as a UN expert. He was visiting India and I was hosting him, taking him around. He said, visiting India as a UN expert is very depressing. I said, what's the problem? He said, you know, I went to Africa and they didn't know I could give them some wise pronouncements and they seem to learn from me. I come here, every guy on the road knows the problem and the solution. The problem is only in the implementation. And he said they were paying him vulgar sums from the UN for telling you what you already know. So he said he was feeling very bad about it. I think this is true in India that we do, I think in principle we know, the real problem is implementation. I suppose it's partly the democracy that is to blame, but none of us would give it up. We're very happy we are a democratic government. But let me go on. The third point is cost competitiveness and domestic demand. One of our problems seems to be that quality has not been one of the part of the public demand in India till recently. Of late, this is changing tremendously. The last 10 years, you can see a dramatic change in the demand for quality goods. And then strengthening education and skill training. I think this is absolutely crucial. This is probably going to be one of the limiting factors like infrastructure in our growth. Unless we strengthen education, I don't think we're going to get very far. Innovation and technology. Innovation, again, technology has been borrowed to a large extent. Now, in the global economy, it's not easy to borrow technology because the people having the technology are willing to invest and start their companies here. So many industries have shown that under this pressure, they can actually innovate and produce remarkable results. I must tell you that the industry people talking to us used to complain 10 years ago. They said, you know, and I'm talking to you, you talk theory. But then they said, they go abroad nowadays and come back and say, those guys also talk theory. Because earlier they could buy technology so that they could talk to somebody who had actually done things. Now they can only talk to profs there, and profs have a tendency to be very similar all over the world. Then benchmarking is another important thing. We are doing this in many sectors now. I think it was pointed out, Mr. Sen gave some examples. I think it's being done extensively in the manufacturing sector here. Finally, the small and medium enterprises and the public sector. The small sector, particularly small-scale sector, has been very vulnerable in India. I think in the last few years, there has been an awakening. The interest rates have changed, but even now it's very vulnerable. I think we need to do something about it because it does, per unit of investment, the employment is much higher in the small-scale sector than anywhere else. I'll just go through each of these very briefly. Infrastructure development, we really need a mission. You probably have to create a mission. We have to look at power, telecom, posts, roads, ports, civil aviation, urban infrastructure, legal infrastructure. All of these has to be looked at simultaneously. We have sometimes been told, in fact, the roads in Tamil Nadu are not so bad now. In Madras, they're actually much better. There was a time 10 years ago or 8 years ago when one of my friends who arrived, he said, you do have roads in between potholes. So practically that situation for a long time, but I think the roads have improved tremendously again in the last 10 years. The golden quadrilateral, however much it may be criticized, it has actually come through to a large extent. I think the situation with roads is changing, but we still need much more. Anybody who's been to Bangalore will vouch for that now. So in all these areas, we need infrastructure creation. I believe it's not the sole responsibility of the government. There is a notion in the public that everything is the responsibility of the government. I think we have to encourage the public to think in terms, and the government to think in terms of public-private partnerships. Power reform, of course, is very badly needed, both center and state, and sector-specific infrastructure funds to attract NRI investment. I think this is another important thing. If you create infrastructure funds and show that you will give them good returns, I think you can attract funds from abroad. And the common testing facilities are another requirement. This is true of manufacturing sector, it's also true of the biotechnology sector. I think it's very important to have common testing facilities. Second is market framework, regulatory environment. Again, fair competition, better access to markets, trade negotiations to provide level playing field for domestic manufacturers. This has been said repeatedly, simplifying and rationalizing regulations, re-examine regulatory accountability, strengthen patent and trademark systems. I think the patent system is very, very difficult. In fact, we find it sometimes easier to get a US patent than to get an Indian patent. But this again is changing in the last 5 years. Except that to get a US patent, you have to invest a lot of money. I must say there's a difference. The reduction of import duties and domestic indirect taxes, WTO compatible export incentives, making FDI easier and simpler. Finally, lower interest rates and labor law reform. I think all these are absolutely necessary. Something is being done on all fronts. In India, we have a tendency to